All right, hello and welcome to the Off by One security stream. Today is Friday, June 23rd, and I've got special guest Tim Medin on this week who is going to talk us through some really cool material that was recently added to the course SANS Sec 560 that he authors and maintains. So I'm sure you've heard of Tim before. He's the brilliant individual who discovered the curb roasting technique and owns a company called Red Siege, which just announced some cool news recently that I'll let him tell you a bit about. But I've known Tim for well over 10 years, I guess now,
Oh my
and
gosh.
he's taught. Someone's saying, "Is there a delay on YouTube?" I don't know. It takes time for the stream to start instantly. Well, it should be okay. I guess if somebody's out there, if you could just let me know that everything's sounding and looking okay, that would be great. What you should see on the screen right now is just a shared desktop with some command text going by. But it also takes a little bit for when you type things because we use an application called StreamYard and it streams out to a bunch of different platforms. It can go to YouTube and LinkedIn and Twitter as well as some other ones as well, Twitch. But for whatever reason, there's a latency when folks enter in any kind of response or comments. Okay, great. Someone said it's okay now. Perfect. So as I was saying, my guest this week is Tim Medin. I've known Tim for, I guess, well over 10 years now. I think we started probably close to around the same time at teaching for SANS. Does that sound right to you?
No, I honestly, one of my first classes was yours. So,
Oh,
so no, no.
so, but it still feels like a long time. Definitely 10 years or more.
Yes, definitely been a while. Yes, that's for true. That's definitely true.
But Tim is also, he's one of the instructors for SEC 660, which is a course that I'm the lead author on, along with Jim Shoemaker. And so, what we're looking at this week, I'll let Tim give a little more information about it, but this was a recent update to the course, and it's something that he wanted to share. But I'll let Tim introduce himself a little bit further, and then I've got one question I've always meant to ask you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. Yeah, I've been teaching for. It's one. I mean, Steve mentioned it, but I should do the math on how long it's been since I've been teaching. But it's been ages now. Been doing the Red Siege things, doing pen testing as the day job, but then teaching all the fun SANS classes all over the place. Lead instructor of 560, and then since you brought it up, yeah, we recently acquired 40 North, so it adds some additional offensive capabilities, and some great people came over.
That's awesome. How big is Red Siege now?
We are 15.
Wow,
I should probably count that better too. Yeah, I think it's 15 people at this point.
that's awesome. Cool. Yeah, the question that I've always wanted to ask you, we've talked about it before, but I wasn't at the original. I think it was Hackfest a long time ago when you, I guess, talked through curb roasting, and I always wanted to ask you, like, how did you come about discovering that? Like, what was the process there?
Yeah, honestly, it wasn't anything particularly exciting or sexy or anything like that. It was some friends and I were just curious. We're like, how the heck does this thing work? And we're like, there's got to be this. Like, there's not that many secrets in Active Directory. Like, it's the password and that's it. So we're like, well, what's protecting those tickets? So it was literally just a conversation I had with friends, and I'm like, you know what? Let me dig into this some more. Wrote some really terrible Python code to test it and confirm that it worked. But it was really just a desire to dig in and just try some of this stuff out. See if I could figure out how this thing worked. A lot of boring time reading RFCs, which is not super exciting. They're a little bit tough to get through, but it was literally just let's see how this thing works and take it apart, and ended up falling in my lap to some degree.
Yeah, it's awesome. And so many things work that way. I tweeted out the other
Yeah,
day that IDA Pro is obviously a reverse engineering tool, and for whatever reason, a couple of revs ago, whenever you bring up the Windows magnifier, it crashes IDA Pro, and I had no idea why. So I started kind of just debugging and looking into that a bit, trying to figure out what was going on. And the magnifier, when you do a certain thing, I'm not going to say until I figure things out more, but it causes a blue screen. And which makes you think like, okay, why is magnifier capable of causing a blue screen? But then you
yeah,
think about it, well, like, font rendering and different things like that. A lot of that code executes in the kernel because it's very complex code and going across, trust barriers and things like that. So it makes sense that if you're messing with the screen resolution or size or zooming in and zooming out, that it's going to be doing some interesting things under the hood. But so many bugs come exactly for discovered exactly from what you were just saying, where like you read through RFCs or you pick a certain topic or technology, and I remember Tavis Ormady many times has said, like, I'm bored this weekend. I think I'm going to start looking at the NTFS driver. And once you start going down at that low level and really getting into the weeds, the bugs just start uncovering themselves, or revealing themselves, I would say. But that's definitely a great way to go about finding things. I always tell people, you've probably heard me say it before too, Tim, like, if you want to get started in finding complex bugs, choose something that's semi-public, or something interesting at least. By semi-public, I mean like DNS or mail or web, things that are exposed, where if you did find a vulnerability in it, it would be pretty critical. Same thing with like TCP/IP.sys driver bugs. Like if you can fling a packet at a system and even just cause it to blue screen, like a denial of service, that's pretty significant. But then if you can get remote code execution, every once in a while someone discovers an RCE in the TCP/IP.sys driver on Windows that was likely there from the dawn of Windows first coming out. So it's incredible that a lot of these bugs just sit there forever. So just picking a service that's interesting, that would be valuable to you if you did discover a vulnerability in it. Recently, I've been looking at Microsoft Terminal Services, which I've been saying outwardly for some time, because memcopy is used all over the place. And as we all know, we allocate a buffer to store or hold some memory, and then we use memcopy or another function to copy the data over into that buffer. Well, the actual calculation of the size argument for memcopy is, when you're dealing with something with compression, encryption, or encoding, it is very complex. So even using something like ChatGPT and giving it the pseudocode and letting it do some analysis to try to help you in determining the size argument is it's been very useful. And there's so many bugs just waiting to get discovered. And the unfortunate thing is, like, yes, there are tons of bugs there waiting to get discovered, but now we're up against all these exploit mitigations where there's so much heap grooming and massaging that you need to do. It makes it quite challenging, but those bugs are still there.
Yeah,
cool.
it's interesting you bring that up, because I think it sort of goes into what we were both talking about, but kind of to take a step back. I get this. I'm sure you get this all the time, Steve. People ask me all the time, like, how do I get into security, or where should I start? And it's honestly, the right answer is whatever you find interesting. Steve digging into terminal services and all that, that sounds horrible to me. But it's something Steve's really good at, develop those skills. And honestly, he's passionate about and interesting. The Kerberos thing, I'm like, I want to figure out how this thing works. There's so many different technologies out there, all the way from just basic packets all the way up to layer 7, but find that fun and interesting thing for you, because if I tell you should definitely do this and you hate it, you're not going to progress anywhere, and you're not going to have fun with it. You're not going to want to pursue a career in it. But it's really pick the thing that you find is interesting and dig into it. I know it's not a great answer, and a lot of people are like, well, you should tell me exactly. No, I can't. There's so many different opportunities. Find the thing that's interesting to you. Find people who know about that and can help you learn it, whatever, and then run with that.
Yeah, for sure. And there's like so many new attack surfaces get introduced, and I always get that question, like, is this stuff not going to be possible soon? Should I not even bother getting into this, because by the time I get far enough along to understand it, it's going to be super secure. But look at AI, for example. That's a whole new attack surface that gets introduced, and anytime that happens, there's things that are going to get discovered. What was that? What's that thing they introduced into Windows? It's almost, I think it's AI based, but it's like Copilot. Is that what it is? Where I think it works alongside a Windows Defender, and I don't remember. I can't speak intelligently about it, but my point being, that's a new attack surface. If it's there, so lots of new opportunities as well. So I guess tell us a little bit about, because I know you want to go through some slides, which is awesome because that makes it much easier to drive through things and explain them. But talk us through a little bit about what you're going to be showing us, and I will, of course, say the demo gods are always there making our lives miserable. So, we'll try to get demos working, but don't be surprised if we have to like bang a wrench against the
wall. Yeah, he says that because you can't see it off screen, but I for some reason, I tested the lab yesterday. It worked. And then today, for some reason, like the VPN connection is just not working. Like the simplest, most basic piece is broken. So it's off screen. I'm like praying. I'm like, please, dear God, finish in time for this demo. But anyway, so I want to talk some about the Active Directory certificate services and the attacks related to that. This the origin of some of these attacks, or I guess the origin of these attacks in this analysis comes from some of the fine folks at Spectre Ops. Again, this was one of those, at least from my understanding of reading their documentation, it was how does this thing work? And it turned into like, well, now that I understand how it works, I wonder if this thing can be used the wrong way, in quotes. But when I first came across this and I first saw that paper, I'm like, you know what? This isn't going to be something that's very common. Like, how do people misconfigure this thing so badly? We do, hundreds of pen tests a year, and my guys are like, this keeps coming up. Like, it seemed like a really basic sort of a configuration issue, and we'll talk through that in more details very shortly. But we see it way more often. I was asking the guys on my team, how often are they seeing these types of attacks in one shape, form, or another? And they're saying almost like a quarter of different organizations have some sort of issue related to all this. So way more impactful than I thought. The access we can get from some of this is like domain level access, domain admin. So extremely privileged. Again, basic misconfiguration leads to this scenario. And before this, I mean, these attacks effectively have been out there for ages. No one knew how to do that, at least publicly. But now we have code. We've got great tools we can look at, find this, and ideally as pen testers, identify these issues and squash them, or help organizations identify and squash these before a real attacker does this and moves very quickly from a regular user up to full permissions, and then probably most likely, like invariably almost at this point, deploys ransomware at scale. Because if you've got that level of access, the damage you can have is tremendous. Cool. So I'm gonna start then with some of the basics. How some of you probably, I use the term here ADCS. Some of you may not even be familiar with it. It's like, what the heck is an ADCS? Well, it's the Public Key Infrastructure, or PKI, from Microsoft. So the Active Directory Certificate Services. I am not going to say that again. I'm just going to say ADCS. But it's comes with Microsoft. It's free, not free. But because of the integration, we see this in a lot of different organizations. So we're going to have things like our certificate authority, which is going to be the trusted authority. When we verify a certificate, we verify things like the name, the trusted chain. In this case, the trusted chain would go back to this certificate authority inside our organization that is trusted through group policy and Active Directory, right? So we see this all the time on inside of the organizations. They're not going to go out to GoDaddy, VeriSign, wherever, to get certificates for internal sites. The management can be a little bit of a pain. There's cost to get those certificates. So what a lot of organizations do is they set this up internally so they can have things like TLS to HTTPS sites on the inside. We'll also see this oftentimes used for authentication. I'm sure many of you working from home connect via VPN. You could have certificate authentication. You might use that for authentication to wireless inside the organization. We've got things like encryption and signing for emails. But we see this technology, as I mentioned before, in many organizations because it's free, right? It's built in. The integration with other Microsoft services makes this quite easy. Integrations with things like Active Directory. Let's go through a couple of the terms here, because I'm going to start using a number of these different terms here. I just want to make sure that you've got some of the basics. The CA, that is the server that is trusted. Yeah, this is the big dog. This is the core, the heart, the soul of the entire PKI infrastructure. Our enterprise CA here, this is going to be sort of the term we use for the CA integrated with Active Directory. Now, when I want to get a certificate, what I don't want to do every single time, let's say we've got thousands of users, I don't want to define what does that certificate look like, what can it be used for. So to make that easier, we're going to have a certificate template. And this says, this is the basic information we're going to use. Let's say if a user wants a new certificate, they can auto enroll, get the certificate for themselves, less admin interaction, consistency. So it looks the same. If we have people doing this manually, we might have more mistakes where it might have, not enough permissions or the right configuration, and we can't do the things we want to do. Could have too much. It just makes things a lot more consistent. Now, if you're setting things up like a web server, HTTPS, right? You're going to have a certificate on that server. Well, to get in that trusted chain, it's going to send a CSR, a certificate signing request, up to that enterprise CA. Enterprise CA is going to use its private key to sign that and demonstrate that, yes, we trust this. And it's going to cascade off of the big dog, off of that enterprise CA, that CA. We're going to talk a little bit about the EKU here, the extended, we also see it referred to as the enhanced key usage. But this describes, it's an OID, a numeric identifiers that describe how can this certificate be used. Can it be used for authentication? Can it be used for encryption? So we'll see some of those EKUs. And the reason we need to dig into that is we see some of the issues with incorrect settings related to that EKU. Digital signature, we talked about that before, right? That is that signature from the CA that says, yes, I trust this. You, the user, trust the CA trusts this certificate, therefore we all trust each other to make sure we're going to the correct site, correct location, and can communicate securely.
Dumb question real quick.
Yo, please, anytime.
So like in the olden days, right, you're always told that the root CA should be offline, should not be connected on the network, and heavily secured if you're talking about like a company that does that for a living, like RSA or
yeah.
Is that still the case today, or is there a requirement like back up into Azure? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so what I see, I've set some of this up in the days when I was on the admin side. What a lot of organizations do, or the modern recommendation is your true big CA is offline until you need it. And then what you'll do is you'll have the big dog, the one that rules them all. It will sign what we call a subordinate certificate authority. And that subordinate certificate authority, that one is oftentimes kept online. So what it allows you to do then is if God forbid that subordinate CA was compromised, you could bring on the root CA, the big one, revoke that, say this is no longer good, and then create other subordinate CA. So the recommendation is keep the big one offline. Now, do people do that? Not very often, realistically, but definitely the ideal scenario is the big one. We very heavily protect that. Like I know some organizations will have a laptop, a desktop, a server, whatever you want to call it, a hard drive, and they'll take that out, lock it in a safe, and only pull it out when you use it. And realistically, that's not very often. You only need it when you have to do something significant, either create a subordinate CA, revoke a subordinate CA, something like that. But yeah, absolutely, very good question.
And someone asked, is it possible ever to attack Active Directory remotely? Because obviously you typically think of Active Directory being internal only, but like with it being out in Azure, if you're replicating and such out there, like is there ever inadvertent mistakes made where that's actually exposed to the internet?
So I have actually seen this was a little while ago, maybe 8 months ago. Was it? I don't forget. Whenever it was, it doesn't really matter. But it's relatively recently, one of the guys on my team saw there was one of the domain controllers for the organization that for some crazy reason was exposed to the internet. And their reason was to connect to Azure, you use something called AD Connect, and it connects to Azure. Now that connection is outbound only. It connects outbound. Of course, there's communication in both directions, but it does not need to be exposed to the internet. And they misunderstood. They put this on the internet. In that case, you very much could. Now, if they've got other services that are based on those accounts that are exposed, if they've got, depending on the protocols that are used, I've seen on the internet things like NTLM v2 authentication enabled, some interesting things there. Of course, the recommendation is don't do any of these things. Use some of the modern technology, use Azure, whether it's pass-through authentication, password hash synchronization, federation, whatever it might be. A whole nother topic. Should not be online, but do we see it? Yes. If it's not exposed, you're typically going to need some sort of internal access unless there's some sort of weird configuration or setting that allows us to interact with that service.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Now, when the Spectre Ops, when they came out with this white paper, the certified pre-owned, if I'm getting the name correctly, they came up with a number of different attacks. Now, we don't have time here to go through all of those because there's 8 of them, at least 8, and there's a number of other scenarios for other sort of attacks or reconnaissance options. But what I did is we looked at the pen test we did and we're like, these are the scenarios that are 1, most common, and 2, the ones with the highest impact. So we're going to take a look at the ESC1. And this is related to a misconfigured certificate template. Now, if you remember, our certificate template is the defaults, right? So if Steve, if we need a certificate for authentication, for email, for Wi-Fi, all we really need to do is provide some basic information like our username. So the misconfiguration here is that what we need here is all of these misconfigurations to align, which honestly, when I first saw it, I'm like, when are we going to see all of these misconfigurations align? And again, more often than I ever thought. Again, we see this way too often in our pen tests. So one thing we need for this is it allows low privileged users, so typically all domain users, everyone, something like that, allows anyone to enroll, which in and of itself is not bad because it allows me as a new employee to automatically get the certificate. The manager approval is not required. What this means is it would then take an additional person to authorize. Again, in and of itself, not a bad thing. If we're trying to automate this, and I join the organization, Steve joins the organization, you don't want to have an admin come in and say yes, yes, yes. Because realistically, yes, the right answer is to be more secure, have the admin approved. But realistically, if they come in, they're not going to know all the users. They're just going to click next, 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 next to make it go away, which is effectively the same thing, but with a delay, right? There's additional authorization signatures, very similar here where we need additional approvals. The certificate template, remember that's the default, where that extended enhanced key usage allows authentication. Again, very common, not a bad thing. If I'm getting a certificate, I need to use it for something. The real problem is when all of this aligns, the big bad thing is this last one. And the bad piece here is allows the user, me, Steve, whomever, to supply what's called a subject alternate name or a SAN. What that does, let's think about a website, right? If you've got a website and you go to like sans.org. Well, if I go to sans.org, it now gets redirected to www.sans.org, right? Well, it's the same server we're going to be going to. So what a subject alternate name says is, hey, this thing can have multiple names. So I could go to www.sans.org, sans.org, maybe some other options in there as well, and have that same server. In this case, what I would say is I'm Tim, but my alternate name, my alter ego, my superhero name is domain admins or some domain admin user or the administrator account. So I can now say, yeah, I'm Tim. But by the way, if you want to check if a Tim has access, and Tim probably wouldn't, this other user might have access. Let's take a look at what it looks like. So what we've got here is if you go into the CA and you look at the actual settings, here are all of the options that we're going to look for. So we see here, for example, authenticated users can request certificates. Again, very common. I wouldn't call this a bad thing by default. Very common scenario. It does not require approval. The number of authorized signatures here is 0. Again, we don't need those extra steps to get the certificate. Again, very common, especially if you want to do automation for things like new users. It allows our domain users here to enroll the certificates. Again, this is another thing that we would commonly expect. I, as a new user, I need a certificate. I need to be able to use this certificate. Not necessarily the bad thing. Now, what are we going to use the certificate for? Here's our EKU. We're going to use it for authentication. Again, we expect this. If I'm getting a certificate, I need to be able to use this. It'd be kind of silly if I couldn't. In this case, in the lab here, this could be used for file encryption, secure email signing, as well as the encryption, client authentication. And we would expect this. Things for like VPN, wireless, or even certificate authentication to the servers. Combine that all together, here's the big bad. We're the subject name. So we supply it in the request. So it allows me to say, yeah, I'm Tim, but my alter ego, the thing I changed to in the phone booth, do we even have phone booths anymore? Whatever. I'm now also administrator, the big dog, the one account to rule them all. Now we've seen a number of tools available for this, and there's not a huge difference between these various tools. It depends. Am I on Windows? Am I on Linux? If I'm on Windows, am I on a host that is joined to the domain, or is it my host that I'm attacking from? The original was certified. This was written by Will Schroeder and Lee Christensen from Spectre Ops. This was released with the original tools. This is sort of the granddaddy of all of the tools. There's CertiPy. This has a lot of the same capabilities. There's actually some additional capabilities here as well, written in Python. The nice thing with this is now I can run it on Windows or Linux. There's also Certi, and these names get really confusing really quickly. Very similar. This comes from the Impacket tool set. So Impacket, just phenomenal set of tools for remote access, running commands remotely, extracting passwords, Kerberos tickets. I swear, every time I think of a new tool and I start Googling for it, I'm like, oh, it's actually already in. It's already in Impacket. So fantastic suite of tools. I feel like I could sit through an entire week of training and only begin to scratch the surface on Impacket. Awesome stuff.
That's a bit of a non sequitur, but you know Bryce Galbraith, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, he taught me, like, because I've always been like an exploit developer, vulnerability researcher and stuff. I've done a lot of pen tests and stuff, but like that wasn't always my forte. And I remember one time he told me about this technique back when Cain and Abel was like a really powerful, great tool. And he's like, if you do RCache poisoning and you turn on the downgrade attack for RDP, he's like, admins are constantly using RDP, and like it was always able to downgrade to the RDP native encryption, which allowed you to get typically every time domain admin credentials. It's almost like cheating, but it works so incredibly well. Like 9 out of 10 pen tests, I felt like, I don't know, it was pretty sad. Did you ever use that technique?
Oh yeah, that was some good stuff back in the day. Yeah, absolutely. The nice thing with Cain, I mean, it's been replaced by a lot of other tools, but the really nice thing with that is it made for really cool screenshots and reports. because it looked big and scary, and there's buttons. It's not just command line, and it was relatively easy to use. You're like, yeah, just poison. And the neat thing with Kane is it brought all of its weapons online automatically. So you didn't have to like say, okay, let's get in the middle, then let's run to the other attack. It would just take care of all of it and just do it all for you, which was kind of neat, a little bit terrifying. I remember one time I was doing some classes for high school and college kids through the Cyber Aces program. And I had a school admin who called me and was upset. Like, hey, you're teaching these kids how to use these tools on the network. And I was like, well, I mean, there's people out there already doing this. There's plenty of YouTube videos or whatever. And the real problem isn't that I'm teaching them how to do it. It's, well, that it's available in the first place, right? That the configurations are there that allow some of this. So I had a nice little chat with him about some of that, but yeah, sometimes it's just too easy. You almost feel bad. Sorry, I'm just off screen here trying to launch something real quick. Run. All right, good deal. All right. My VPN looks like it worked, Steve.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we'll see if everything else works. Okay, so one of the first things that we need to do here is we need to identify the certificate servers. So here's an example with Certify, again, the original tool, where we're going to identify the CAs. So that's CA plural. And it shows us a lot of different information included in that. We're going to see things like, here's an example here where users can enroll. In this case, we see authenticated users. Once again, something we would oftentimes expect. We don't think this is necessarily going to be a bad thing. It just requires some of the other things to be in place for this to be really a bad scenario. Again, without this would be much more of an admin process. Realistically, a significantly larger burden on the admins where they would have to do this manually. And who wants to be the keyboard or mouse jockey that's going to be clicking through this? Here's going back to Steve's point. Here's the easy button. So we run certify find /vulnerable. So it looks at the templates and says, yep, here's a bad one for you. In this case, we can see the enrollee supplies the subject. Authorized signatures are not required. Scroll down a little bit further. We see client authentication is supported. We would expect that. Enrollment rights, domain users, again, expect that as well. Again, the key here is the user supplies the name. That's the real bad thing in this entire scenario here. At that point, what we can do is we can request a certificate. Now, certify, I'm going to do this in the demo in a little bit, but this tool really wants you to be connected to an existing domain joined computer running under the context of a user. So let's say I've got Cobalt Strike, Mythic, Covenant, Sliver, whatever. On a compromised host, I could load this into memory and run it on that system. Now with the lab, we're going to see here in a little bit, my VM is not joined to the domain, so it's going to be a little bit limited. I'm not saying this tool isn't good, because it's absolutely outstanding. It just doesn't work in certain scenarios. So here's an example here where we can see we're requesting a user. The current user here is Wilson P. We specified the alternate name with the /alt name. Here we have selected an administrator on the network. In this case, we didn't select the domain admin. I could pick the domain admin account, or I can pick any user I want to. In this case, it's likely because it's named DADM at the end. It's probably domain admin. We can see the response, and then below that, we're going to see the private key. Once we have that certificate, we need to convert it into a format that we can use with other tools. So here we're going to use OpenSSL and just simply convert the format so we can use it with another tool. One tool we can use it with, Rubius. Rubius, fantastic tool here for doing a lot of different Kerberos attacks, which, by the way, in day 5 of 560, we also talked through Rubius. But we're going to specify the certificate here, give it the user, and we can now get a ticket granting ticket. So without going too deep into Kerberos, if I have a ticket granting ticket, this is, as a user, it essentially allows me to access any service that user has access to. Now, of course, if it's a very powerful account, a domain admin account, realistically, that probably means anything and everything. So we see the request here. We get then the base 64 ticket in response. We then use Rubius to pass the ticket, PTT here. What this simply does is takes that ticket and loads it into memory. So now when this Windows system wants to authenticate, it's going to say, hey, do I have a ticket granting ticket? Oh, I've got one. Cool. Let me use this ticket granting ticket to request tickets for the services. Again, this ticket granting ticket is for our privileged account. And now I can start accessing any one of those services. And we can see in the example here on the screen where without loading this ticket into memory, the user we're running as Wilson P does not have permissions to the domain controller. We load that into memory. Windows says, hey, I should authenticate. Cool, I've got this ticket. Let's use that. And we can now see the access here. Right? The interesting thing here is it's going to show our regular user, but because remember we have that subject alternate name where I've specified in this case that domain admin account. And again, you can pick any user you want to. We're now able to access that system even though that Wilson P couldn't add themselves. So here is now CertaPy. This is the Python version. Version maybe is the wrong term because it's not identical. But CertaPy here, we're going to say find. We need to specify the credentials with certify, the original executable. We need to be running in the context of that user. With CertaPy, I can specify the credentials so I can run this now on a computer that is not joined to the domain. So we'll run CertaPy find, specify the IP address, the domain controller, and then it gives us a couple of output files. You get text, and if you hate yourself, you can look through the JSON. Once again, we can look through our template. So we see the template here for user auth. Client authentication is true. Not a bad thing. Enrollee supplies subject. Not a good thing. Does not require approval, does not require the additional signatures, and allows the enrollment for any users. Tool automatically just shows you, it says, hey, you are vulnerable to ESC1. All those other auto enrollment features are enabled in addition to the supplying the alternate name. With that, I can use CertaPy to request the ticket. I need to specify the credentials, the name of the certificate authority, which, by the way, is not the same as the server name for the certificate authority. We'll see this in just a moment. Specify the vulnerable template, specify the user we want to request a ticket for, get the DNS server, the domain controller, and now we have our certificate. We can also use this PFX file now with CertaPy to authenticate. In this case, we can get the NT hash then for that user. Once I have that hash, I can use pass the hash to access any one of these resources throughout the organization. I can also use that hash to request things like a ticket granting ticket and use Kerberos for authentication to these services as well. So that's ESC1. ESC4 here is kind of the same as the first one in a way. The real issue here is the permissions on the template allow anyone to edit the security settings, which you're probably thinking like, well, yeah, clearly that one is bad, right? But if no one's looking for it, back in the day when this was set up, maybe you didn't think about it. Nobody's analyzing this. So what it allows us to do effectively is take this ESC4, turn it in to ESC1. So I can then make the changes to the template, allow me to specify the subject alternate name, make other changes. Now I can request that certificate and do whatever I would like. So here is certify, so the original executable, showing us the enrollment rights, showing us that we can use it for server authentication. Once again, not a bad thing. But we can see here that anybody can, in this case, authenticated users, can write this template. So it allows full modification of the template. Here is, let's say, the original. So we've got our original certificate template here. Client authentication is false. Can't use it for any reason. It does allow server authentication, and authenticated users can enroll. It grants, this is the problem here, it allows authenticated users to modify this. So we can use ESC4. ESC4 isn't a direct attack itself. What ESC4 does is allows us to take ESC4, turn it into ESC1. So enable those vulnerable vulnerable settings that we discussed a little bit earlier. So we're going to modify our template here. The really cool thing, and this is a well thought out feature, is it saves the previous configuration so that I can modify this template and then I can put it back to how it was. So I can clean up afterwards. Is it still insecure? Yes. The attacker can still do this. This is not a mitigation technique. This is me as the pen tester putting this template back to how it was because I don't want to break things, right? We want the admins to actually lock this thing down. That's not my responsibility as the pen tester. So after making the modification here, we can see that client authentication is true. We can see all the different changes there. Permissions, again, unchanged. And now we can see we've got ESC 1, 2, 3, and 4. Again, at this time, we don't have time to go through 2, 3, and a number of the others here as well. Request the certificate, just like we did before. We can also then put that back. So here is the scenario where we're going to restore the template to its original permissions and settings. Again, not a mitigation. This is not how you fix the issue. This is, I have taken 4, made it vulnerable to 1, retrieved the request and the certificate like we talked about before, and then put it back to the state it was in so that if I look at this certificate now, the settings are back to the original configuration. All right, we got just a couple left here before we jump into the lab exercise. ESC8, the big thing with this is it allows relay. If you're familiar with the printer bug, very, very sort of a similar scenario. Again, approval not required, the signature is not required, enrollment is allowed by any user. We allows authentication here, allows a certificate to supply a subject alternate name, but allows us now to relay. So a user authenticates to us, we essentially pass that through, just like our traditional sort of relay attacks. Once we have that,
questions.
Yeah.
Oh, so you can go. If you want to finish this up, you can.
Oh, this is my last slide. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, tools for this, NTM Relay X. This is used for just a regular NTLM relaying, and then there's the ADCS PWN tool here as well. Go ahead, Steve.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean that's great. It's such a great slide deck to go through. Super helpful. I guess a couple questions are going by, and I had a couple questions myself too. Like how common is this? Like, do you see this all the time? Is it 1 out of every 10 times? Like, as far as like you can get some pretty good value out of these attacks?
Yeah. So I don't know the breakdown. What I did when I wrote this portion of the deck is I was looking at our previous pen tests and identifying which are the most common. And I also talk to the experts on my team and say, hey, which ones are you seeing that are most common and the biggest impact? First thing they threw out was 1 and 4, and they're like, all right, 8's not too terribly far behind it. 8 is a little bit more complicated of a scenario because of the relaying. We've been seeing this in like 20%, sometimes more of our assessments. Again, I did not think, I saw this, I'm like, it's never going to happen in the real world.
Right.
My guy started using it and was like, oh, well, it's way more common than any of us thought, unfortunately.
Yeah, 20% certainly worth taking a look at. I always tell people, a lot of these techniques we talk through, especially when teaching a class, like something silly like VLAN hopping. Well, when can we possibly do VLAN hopping? It's like, well, there's like 4 different ways that I know off the top of my head you can do it. It's not like you're going to come across it every time, but if you know to look for DTP packets for dynamic trunk protocol, if you know to look for this or that, then like when you do see it pop up in a Wireshark capture, like that's something you can go and take action on. You also use another tool just for a second, but it made me think that OpenSSL is super underutilized by people during penetration tests. Like the power that you've got to be able to go and interact with things by setting the encryption options specifically to what you want them to be, and all kinds of other things you can do with OpenSSL. It's a super cool tool. I think Jim Shoemaker reminded me of that recently.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that with the DTP because by the way, that's covered in Sec 660, Steve's class. I also teach that. And it's literally a slide in there that says, isn't this old? Yes. It works, especially in organizations where they have like IP phones. Like it's not even really, and I almost feel bad. Like it's not a bug; it's a feature. Yeah. And you just hop on that voice network, and now if that voice network isn't the proper security settings, or if there's servers on that network that aren't properly hardened and defended, then you can have a lot of fun. But yeah, literally, one of my guys was using like that VoIP hopper tool last week. It's still tremendously useful, even though you hear people like, well, that's old. Yeah, it works. Use it. Right.
Yeah. VoIP hopper with them. And obviously the daisy chaining of your laptop or computer to a phone just makes sense because you don't want to run extra cables and such. And that one pops up all the time. Oh. But yeah, I don't know. There's just so many of these tools. So someone else had elaborated on their earlier question around, sorry if you hear some sirens outside. Like I said, I'm in Los Angeles right now, and it's always sirens going by. So going back to the exploiting Active Directory remotely, unless mistakes happen, like someone inadvertently exposes it to the internet, which seems like it would take a lot of work to do that, but things happen. Same thing like you were saying with the conditional stuff. So many times, like you're like, okay, I found a vulnerability, but the conditions have to be like the stars have to align in a certain way. How likely is that to happen? And then often, more often than you think. But the question is, see here if I can find it. I said he saw a bank organization that allowed a department to still access the internet while logged into their computers via Active Directory. Is that a good idea?
Well, I mean, if you don't allow, maybe I think I'm misunderstanding the question, but if you don't allow users with internet access, they're going to quit. I feel like there's more to that question. I might be missing something on that.
Yeah, I'll read it one more time. So, since it's kind of challenging to exploit Active Directory remotely unless mistakes happen, like exposing it to the internet, he said, I saw a bank organization that allowed a department to still access the internet while logged into their computers via Active Directory. Is that a good idea?
Oh, that's hard. I mean, you could set up some sort of sandboxing where certain processes run as a completely different user and access the internet. Realistically, that I would have to assume that's literally 100% of the organizations I've ever interacted with. It's just you're logged in your computer, you can open up your browser, you're already logged into Active Directory. Without question, that's going to happen a lot. And if you can compromise that host, then of course you've got a lot of attacks available to you.
Yeah. Cool. All right, let's let you jump into the demo here.
Sure. All right, so what I've got here is this computer is not joined to the domain. So what I'm doing here is I'm running a command prompt as this bgreen user inside the Hyboxy domain. Hyboxy is the target organization in this case. So I'm running as this user. It's not quite the same as actually being joined to the network. Your computer configuration is going to be different. Some of the context of the computer environment variables isn't going to quite match, but this is going to allow us to take a look at our certify. I get the right terms here. Certify here. So what I'm going to run here is I'm going to run certify here with CAS to enumerate here our certificate server, right? So just simply set CAS, give it the domain here. We see here, this is the name of the certificate, the CA. Now this is not the computer name, okay? So this confused me for a while here. It is the name of the CA, not the name of the server. And I get a little bit confused there. So for example, if you look down a little bit further, if I remember correctly, the server name, do we have it down here a little bit further? Yeah, the server name here is just CA01, but the CA itself has this name. It's a little bit confusing, but they do have a little bit different names. Okay, so we see the root CA here. That's the what is it? The DN, the distinguished name for that particular services. If we scroll down, we see the permissions here, allow enroll authenticated users. Again, in and of itself, not necessarily a bad thing here. So what I'm going to do here is clear my screen so it's a little bit easier to read. And now I'm going to run the find vulnerable. Okay. So it's going to run a lot of those same things that we saw before here. What I'm going to see here, if I scroll up, oh, here it is right here. The vulnerable certificate templates. So this template name here is user authentication certificate. If we look through here, we see the enrollee supplies the subject, which by the way, this not aligning drives me nuts. Whatever. The enrollee supplies the subject. That's the bad thing where I can say, yeah, I'm Tim, but you can call me domain admin. Authorized signatures is 0. It allows client authentication. The enrollment rights here, because I'm not joined to the name to the domain, it can't reverse resolve this SID back to the real name. But 513 here is domain users. Wait, did I say that? Is it domain users or is that domain users? Okay, so it allows anybody to enroll here. So applies the subject, 513. So, and by the way, I'm not typing these commands here on screen. I have a cheater off screen because having you watch me type is painful. Here's the request. This is the computer name here. I am authenticating here as B Green. I've given it the vulnerable certificate here. I'm telling it my alternate name. It raps funny here, but my alternate name, my alter ego, my superhero name is administrator, and then I end up getting the certificate here. I'm in the funky directory. Now, the problem is because I'm not joined to the domain, this computer is not joined to the domain, I'm a little bit stuck as far as taking the next step. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to my Linux VM, and we're going to take a look at CertaPi. All right. So I've got my VPN connected. So I've got my VPN connected here. I'm going to run the find command as bgreen with the credentials of password 1, super secure. And what we're going to see here is 2 output files. There's a JSON file and there is a text file. Let's quickly take a look at the text file here. We can see the template name, user authentication certificate. We see that client authentication is enabled. The really bad piece here, the attacker supplies the name. Manager approval, no, and no additional authorized signatures are required here. Let's take a look a little bit further down in that output. And we can see that the permissions allow enrollment for domain users. That was the 513 that we saw a little bit earlier. Okay. So what I want to do now is request that certificate and execute the attack. I need a few things. I need the CA name. So I'm going to grep through my text file, and I've got now my CA name. We saw that up on the screen just a little bit further up. Remember, this is not the host name. You will get that confused. Well, maybe you're smarter than I am and you don't, but I definitely got that confused. So I need to now execute my request. So I'm requesting as B Green with my credentials. I've given it the name of the CA. I've specified the vulnerable template. Here's the user we're targeting, and this is my target. This is the computer name. This gives me now my certificate. So what I need to do now is I can use this to authenticate. So we use certify auth, give it my PFX file, and what I've got right now is this is the hash for the domain admin. And with this hash, I can use pass the hash. I can request a ticket granting ticket because the ticket granting ticket request is based on the password hash for the other user. So at this point, because it is the administrator, I can probably access any domain resource inside the organization.
What were the limitations that the pass the hash got a few years ago?
Yeah, so there was a patch a number of years ago. It was originally called like mitigation for pass the hash, and we figured out very quickly that it really wasn't. It was in the era right after the Target breach. If you're not familiar with the Target breach, but one of the things the attackers did is they either had the hash or the password, we don't know, for a local service account that was the same credential on every single computer in the organization. And they used this as a de facto domain administrator to access every computer with high privileges. What that mitigation really did is it prevented authentication against local accounts only on the computer, not domain accounts, over the network. So it doesn't prevent anything like this because this is a domain account. You're not going to have any issues with that whatsoever.
Yeah, that's funny because I remember when I came out, people were like, "Oh, PSExec's not going to work anymore. This isn't going to work anymore." All these things, like,
yeah. I mean, it's a domain account. It works just fine. Hasn't slowed us down a little bit, even a little bit.
Cool.
Yeah, so we're just demonstrating here the ESC1 how it works. We could do this sort of additional stuff with 4 to enable to get ESC1 and to execute the same sort of attack here. And the relay, it's a little bit complicated to set up in a demo like this.
So someone was asking, is there a patch that's going to come out from Microsoft to not allow the misconfiguration? Like if the admin creates a certificate template which allows a setting for ESC1, then Windows blocks it if you have authenticated users as permitted users to enroll the certificate or something. Like, do you think anything's going to come out to prevent this from?
I don't know how you do that, because now you're telling the admins you're making active changes to their network and their setup. I don't know how you could effectively do that. Now they might put protections and warn you, say, hey, this isn't a good idea. But applying a patch that goes back and changes configurations that admins have already made, I can't see that happening.
Yeah, cool. It's interesting. I guess more around the defense, because people always ask that for some reason. What's the best way to not to make it so you don't do this? Is there? Yeah. I guess I'm trying to understand more about how hard is it to make this mistake, and is there some easy way for people to avoid making the mistake?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a way to prevent the mistake, but you can literally use these exact same tools to identify these issues in your organization. You don't have to be a red teamer. In fact, I have done a talk a number of times in various forms, blue about not being red. And it's, as a blue teamer, here's the tools that you can use, the same tools that I use, to identify these issues and ideally fix it before anything bad happens. So, I mean, literally, just use the exact same tools that I showed. Use Certify with the find vulnerable. You could use Certify. to identify that and then make the changes and the configuration changes yourself. And
Is it something that you can check just the domain controller, one set of systems, or is it something that they make the mistake over here, but not all these other places?
I don't know how this works in a forest. I just don't know. Honestly, knowing the Spectre Ops folks and the quality that they put out, it probably works in there. But I mean, one of the things that this does, if there's multiple CAs in the organization, it does identify that.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, if anyone else has a question for Tim that you want to throw out there, now's a great time. We don't often get the opportunity to ask questions to someone very busy like Mr. Medin here, so I like to take advantage of it. One of the great things of knowing so many people is being able to have like friends and acquaintances and just smart people on here, and I get to ask the questions selfishly that I want to ask too.
Yeah, and to that point, if you go to conferences, find the whatever community and ask people questions. Like I get people ask me all the time about Kerberos. I'm excited to tell them because it's my baby. It's something I work really hard on, and most people, if they're working on something and they've published it and the information's out there, and you ask for like a clarification or a help, the vast majority of the time, assuming you're not interrupting them at dinner with their family, they're going to be excited to tell you about it because they worked really hard on that. So don't be afraid of asking people some of these questions. Ask other people who, maybe it's the original creator. It could be other people who have learned how to use these tools, but there's a lot of opportunity out there.
Is it still the case when you're authenticating, I guess, to a Kerberos environment or Microsoft Kerberos environment where your, I guess if I'm going way back, this is from memory, so it's probably going to be wrong. But I remember like one of the things we did in the old days with NTLM version 1, version 2 was like there was no salt on the password stored in the SAM database, but that there was some kind of a handshake that occurs that basically does the same thing effectively as a salt, but you're still sending the password hash in some form across the wire. Right. And then so when Kerberos came out with Microsoft, they changed it to where they use your password hash. Active Directory database uses your password hash as the key to encrypt some like session object or whatever you want to call it that gets sent back. And like your ability to decrypt it and make some modifications and then re-encrypt it with your password hash as the key is your proof to the domain controller that you are who you say you are, correct?
Yep. Yeah, the whole ticket grantee ticket process is based on the user's password hash. The service ticket that's the one you're going to present to the server to say, hey, I'm Tim, I'm supposed to have access, is encrypted using the server's password hash. If I can get that password hash by either compromising that system, that service, the account in some way, shape, or form, or my favorite tool, Kerberos, you can now modify that service ticket and say, I'm no longer Tim, I am a domain admin. And we can re-encrypt and re-sign because it's not a bug, it's a feature. And you can't patch features without breaking functionality. Like we're going to have the Kerberos and many of the Kerberos attacks, they're going to be around for a very long time until we literally redo that entire protocol or use a different protocol because it's fundamentally how it works. Like you can't change it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that exact question. Like, Bloodhound and spraying, password spraying, and Kerberosing, and golden ticket and silver ticket, all that stuff has been around for quite some time now. I was just going to ask you that question. Like, when do you see things changing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the good things that we've seen is with the movement to the cloud, we got to start over. The big problem is you have to have the backwards compatibility. Like we knew 20 years ago, maybe not quite that long ago, but we knew that for the longest time that LM hashes were terrible. It takes the password, converts it to uppercase, splits it into 2 7-character chunks.
Oh, LAN manager, yeah.
yeah, right. But we knew that, but it was built into those versions of Windows. And if you could upgrade all of your Windows systems or change the authentication, but if you were talking to other systems, maybe they didn't support NTLM v2 or NTLM authentication at all. It just takes a lot of time, especially when it's fundamental to the protocol. making changes there, there is no simple patch. You have to restart, essentially deprecate, remove the LM with an entirely new version of Windows. And even once that happens, it takes years and years and years for that rollout to happen before it can effectively go away. So we're going to see some of these Kerberos attacks, for the next decade, unless something happens where this is going to start going away. I don't see it changing anytime soon.
Yeah, and you also have the compatibility between non-Microsoft systems still being able to access.
Oh yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I guess that about wraps it up there. I got Moses Frost is going to be on next Friday to talk about some more cloud hacking stuff. I don't know exactly what he's got in store, but he wants to come back in and show us some cool stuff there. So I'm excited about that one. I think 2 weeks from today, I'm not going to name the individual yet because I haven't confirmed it yet, but I've got somebody coming on, hopefully that's really strong in adversarial machine learning and AI. So that should be a really fun one to talk about. Like, because you think about adversarial AI, like if you went to RSA or watch some of the talks, almost everyone talked about AI. It's some way, shape, or form. So, you've got things like vishing and phishing, and the cool things you can do there. We saw maybe Rachel Toback on CNN and stuff, like doing some cool things there where you get enough audio into a machine learning environment and is able to say whatever you want. Kind of like we go way back on, which movie was that? That wasn't Hackers. That was the better one. The old hacker movie. The really cool one.
Sneakers.
Sneakers, yeah.
Love that. That's the best one.
Yeah, because they actually did things that were legit. So
yes.
I remember she was recording the guy and intentionally trying to get him to say things so that she could go past voice authentication. But like with AI, like that's one thing we can do. Vishing and phishing is easier, and obviously you're going to see that stuff get much more real convincing. And then you've got things that I've used it for personally, like I mentioned earlier, giving it pseudocode and having it help you look for vulnerabilities or decipher some things. But then there's also the attack surface that is AI itself. And I'm sure you've heard of things like prompt-based attacks. That's like the most common one. But then like sponge attacks where you're like eating up the resources in the environment. But I'm sure you've all heard too, like the very first data set that an AI gets on a particular topic has a profound effect on that specific topic going forward. So there's obviously ways to poison it and do some neat things. So I'm excited because I don't know really much at all about adversarial AI. So that'll be a really fun one to do.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Sweet. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for coming on. If you have any parting words, please say so. Otherwise, have a great weekend, everyone, and Tim is included.
No, yeah. Thanks, Steve. By the way, if anybody has questions on this or anything else, just email me, tim@redsiege.com, or hit me up on the tweeters.
Yeah, and I'll check to see if I'm not sure. I'll ask Sans if we could possibly get like a PDF export of this section so we can post a link. But I can't promise anything. I'll check though. If I do get it, I will put it in the description, like maybe by next week. Sweet. All right.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
See ya.